Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Today, I'm talking with Emily Plank, author of Discovering the Culture of Childhood. It's the read-along selection this year for Not Just Cute readers. That means instead of one overview, I get to have several in-depth chats with Emily, which is a good thing because she is a fun one to talk to. In this episode, we'll be discussing the introduction of her book, what it's all about, and what sparked the idea. Don't miss her explanation for the section heading, The Day My 3-Year-Old Brought Home a Condom. Trust me, you want to get the rest of that story. Emily invites us to put on a new pair of spectacles and see childhood in a new way. And what she helps us discover there is truly fascinating. You can find the show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 3. And be sure to join the read-along of Emily's book, Discovering the Culture of Childhood. We'll have subsequent discussions with her here on the podcast, including her answers to your questions. So be sure to submit those questions, and you can read about how to do that on the show notes again at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 3. So now, let's get started. Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks so much.
What I wanted to do to start off is just to get people to know a little bit about you, because you have a great story just behind you. And just to let people know, as we record this, it's 11 a.m. where I live, and it's 8 p.m. where you live. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
So tell us about where you are, what you do, and just the story about you and your family.
Okay. Well, yes, this is a good idea to put me into context. So I grew up in Los Angeles and lived my whole life. I went to college in California and started off as a middle school math and science teacher, and then kind of found my way into early childhood about 5 years after I started teaching, and totally fell in love with the age and the phase. And at this time, my husband and I and our children were living in Iowa. And I ran a family childcare program for 7 years, and I did teaching and consulting with other adults and other family childcare practitioners. And my husband and I got this really cool opportunity to sail around the world on a ship.
Amazing.
So it's not something that happens every day. So we sailed with a program called Semester at Sea. And so for 4 months at the beginning of 2014, myself, my husband, and our 3 small children, who were at the time 6, 4, and 2, sailed on board a ship with 600 college students and 200 faculty, staff, and their families, and about 200 staff people on the ship. And we sailed from California. We sailed across the ocean to Japan, all the way around Asia, all the way around Africa, and we ended in London. So we got to see 16 different cities in 12 different countries, and it was life-changing. So
I can only imagine.
Anyways, that's kind of, the story of my book is rooted in that story. So you kind of have to know where I was and what I was doing.
You are a world traveler.
Yeah, and so kind of by accident, I think. But while we were on the ship, my husband got the next invitation for his work, which took us to Switzerland, which is where we're living now. So we moved here 2.5 years ago, and I got a contract to write a book just as we were moving. So I have shifted to full-time writing, and I still travel a little bit for consulting, but mostly I write, and I'm learning French. So that's what we're doing now.
And remind me, how old are your children now, your own children?
Now they are 9, 7, and 5. They're totally bilingual now, which just blows me away.
It's fascinating how children can do that.
I know, it's amazing.
Really, really brilliant. So tell me, in the context of that, you mentioned that this context of you traveling the world is kind of where the idea for this book came from. And we should mention, again, the book is called Discovering the Culture of Childhood. So tell me about how or what sparked this initial idea for the book, kind of this seminal idea.
Yes. Okay. So the idea to write a book came about 2 years before the idea for this actual book. I as I was running my family childcare program, I was doing a lot of blogging, and I found that I really liked it. I didn't care so much about writing when I was in high school or writing essays in college, but once I got to write about things that I was really passionate about, I found that I loved it. So I started blogging, and I remember a conversation with my husband one night where I said, I just had this one post, and it had like 10 different things on this list. And I said, I think I could turn this into a book. What if I wrote a book? I think each one of these things could be a chapter, and it was all about play. And, of course, he was like, great, that sounds awesome. So kind of in the evenings and on the weekends and when children were napping, I would begin to write away on this book. And it was when we started to sail that I got more serious about figuring out how to actually write a book. I bought a book called How to Write a Book Proposal. And I began to actually focus in more specifically on, targeting a publisher and figuring out how that works. So as I was working, this original idea that I'd had, which was then 2 years in the making, was getting a little tiring to me. And I had adjusted the original list of 10 things, and I was working on 7 different ideas about play. And it was so I had one chapter to go that I was trying to flesh out for this book proposal. And it was while we were in Japan. My children and I were we were in a metro station in Tokyo. And I had this experience that was just profound. We were standing in this metro station, and you cannot believe and imagine the amount of activity that was in this underground system. The fluorescent lights were buzzing, all the pedestrians were pushing back and forth, people in business suits, mothers with their children, religious people in their dress, people all over in all different walks of life going everywhere. I mean, it was just chaos. But when you came to the escalators, everybody stood on the left-hand side of the escalator and left this open lane on the right. So it was totally organized amidst this mass flurry of activity. And so we got on the escalators, and we're riding the escalators up. And as we're riding the escalators, we, Americans, stood on the left on the escalator also. And I almost saw myself from above, like I zoomed out for a moment and saw the whole situation unfolding. And I realized, I was like, wait a second, I'm not Japanese. I know nothing about the Japanese culture, but I knew to step on the left because I knew to pay attention to the insiders. I knew that I'm an outsider. I knew that I should pay attention to the insiders. And I went back and forth from the Japanese to my children and to the Japanese and my children. And I had this I had this epiphany. I said, what if we adults are outsiders to childhood? And what if the problems that we have sometimes as adults interacting with the children in our care or our own children, what if those problems are intercultural and not biological or not, a product of a phase of development or something? What if there's a cultural component to this? And so I had this, massive epiphany, and I came back to the ship and I wrote this last chapter, and I wrote the outline for this last chapter, and I sent it off to the publisher, and I told my husband, I said, I really hope that they take this proposal because I've spent so much time on it and I'm so invested in it, but really, if they don't take the proposal, I think what I'm going to do, or even if they do take the proposal, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one chapter about culture, and I think I'm going to turn it into a whole book because I think it's a really neat idea, and I don't think anybody's talking about it yet. And so I sent my proposal off to my publisher, to Red Leaf, and they wrote me back and they said, this is great. We love your voice. We think you'd be wonderful as one of our authors. We have a ton of books about play. We don't need any more books about play, but there's this one chapter about culture that's really interesting. And so they kind of caught the spark too. And so from there, we then kind of collaborated over the next several months and designed a new outline, and I took it and ran. So that's the long story of how it comes about.
I love that story. And, as you talk about your experiences, kind of this out-of-body experience in a different culture, it reminded me when I was in college, I did just a short study abroad in Costa Rica. And I had kind of a similar experience where so much of my time there exploring the culture and the people and the places was within this group of students from the United States. And there was one day that everyone went to do some adventure, and I decided to stay in the city on my own. It was, you know, we'd been there a while, and so I was a little more comfortable. And so I, for the first time, rode the bus by myself and, you know, walked down the streets by myself. And it was a completely different experience. And I just kind of, like you're saying, I wonder if there's a similar application where we as adults, you know, we sit amongst ourselves and you get a completely different perspective than when you really immerse yourselves into the culture, rather than when I talk to teachers, I talk about lifeguarding, that sometimes we just stand back and observe from a distance. We're kind of the lifeguard up on the chair. But this experience for me, when I really immersed myself as an individual, I felt like it was that one day was a completely different experience from all the other days apart, because I really immersed myself. Yes.
And I think for me, that's it. I mean, that is the moment where all of this begins to unfold, because, and this is going into a little bit of a different subject matter, but when I came back with this idea about culture, I have no background in anthropology. I don't know anything about the field of science that studies culture, but I started to read and to learn about this field of anthropology, and I learned that there was, you know, for the period of the 1800s and well into the 1900s, the common idea about human culture was that it was situated along a continuum. So human cultures, human races could be classified based on their technological advancements, from savage all the way through civil. And of course, nowadays our ears kind of cringe to hear that anybody in the scientific community would classify people groups based on this scale that includes savage and barbaric and Neanderthal and, you know, this terminology that's so problematic now. But up until the 1940s, this is how anthropologists were taught. And it was there was an anthropologist by the name of Franz Boas, and he was living among a people group that had been categorized as savage. And as he was living among this group, there's this great quote, and I'm going to pull it up real quick. There's this great quote where he says, "I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over that of the savages, and find, the more I see their customs, that we have no right to look down on them. We have no right to blame them for their forms and superstitions which may seem ridiculous to us. We, quote, highly educated people, quote, are often much worse, relatively speaking." You know, so he has this experience from living among people who are different than him, where he realizes that this whole notion of a continuum is totally garbage. And so he comes up with this new theory. He says, no. We're not going to classify people on this continuum anymore. Culture is not something that you have. You know, the pinnacle is not held by white Western Europeans. Culture is something that everybody possesses. It is a lens through which we see the world. And our task, he's speaking of anthropologists, our task is to figure out what lens other people are using and why they're using it. And for me, as an early childhood educator, this was transformational, because, like you said, it's parents and it's educators, when we are with children and when we watch the way children are interacting, we think some of the things that we say that we hold commonly about childhood, it's just not true. The fact that, you know, children are that toddlers are egocentric, or, you know, the whole notion of the terrible twos, it's just not true. If you can look at it from the inside, or if you can at least look at it from as close to the inside as you can possibly get, you see it totally differently. So, you know, I connect with your idea that this notion of trying to invest yourself, not lifeguarding, but trying to invest yourself within, you know, what I think is the culture of childhood. When you try to look from within, you see it totally differently than you do as an outsider.
Absolutely. And I think it's important, well, and I'll make sure I'm understanding correctly, when you mentioned before that it's not just developmental, you're not arguing that there isn't a developmental progression, or that we, you know, ignore what we know about development, but that there's also a cultural subtext within that we have to, that our perspectives need to be kept in check.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, so there's, this continuum model that existed within anthropology, I think in early childhood education we have something similar, which is our developmental model, which is purely biological. And of course, the biological model is still relevant in early childhood education, whereas in anthropology, the continuum model is totally bogus. We throw it out completely. So there still is something to be said for the biological transitions. And me as a parent or as an early childhood educator, if I know the signs, like I know that a child crawls first and then they walk, and I know how to support the movement between one place and the next, that's really important information for me to have so that I can create a space that's safe, to create a space that's encouraging. But the problem is when we only plot children on that continuum model, on that developmental model, when we only stick to that developmental model, we begin to look at children as not yet fully human, rather than as fully human in who they are in and of themselves, becoming different people as they grow.
And you use a quote that I love, that Dr. 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 stated that I think speaks to this continuum model, that the defect that's there in seeing that kind of the more adult a child is, the better they are, the more developed they are. And her quote was that children aren't just defective adults. And I think that that's really a big piece of what we see in this whole approach that is endangering developmentally appropriate practice, that rather than seeing them for who they are, where they are, and valuing that space in their development, we're just seeing, like you said, we use the continuum in a way that just places value at the end, at the pinnacle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we look at children as not yet. So, I mean, I think it's classic when you look at parents of new children. The first questions that you get, is he sleeping through the night yet? Is he sitting up yet? Is he eating solid foods yet? Everything is a yet. There's no, and not that those are irrelevant questions, because to the parent who is sleep deprived, that notion of when is he going to sleep through the night is a really important thing to wrestle with and to hold on to. But what it does is, when you're just looking to that next stage, I mean, I've heard people use this developmental model as a defense for things like, we need to teach them to sit still on the carpet because they're going to have to when they get to kindergarten. So we use it as this model for justifying potentially developmentally inappropriate interactions with children, because we're helping to get them ready for what comes next, rather than interacting with them authentically and wholly for who they are as the human beings now, knowing that by honoring that whole human being, you are preparing them for the next stage of development, because that's what it means to move through life.
Right. I think there is a common misunderstanding that I feel that in that developmental spectrum, like you said, that there's this pressure that we need to push them along, rather than that this spectrum is established because at each point in time, they need to do what is meant for that stage in order to prepare them to move on. That rather than doing tomorrow's work today, we do today's work today. And we'll
Absolutely.
Tomorrow.
And it becomes ridiculous if you contemplate what that developmental spectrum looks like continued out through adulthood. So I don't feed myself on a liquid diet because I might not be able to digest solid foods later on in my life, and I don't prepare by spending time in a wheelchair every day because I might someday no longer be able to walk. I mean, I don't look towards the future and the things that might come in front of me and bring those things back to where I am now as a way of preparing myself. I do things like making healthy choices about how I eat, hoping that those might prepare me well for what comes in the future. Mm-hmm. But I don't use the future as a prescription for what I have to do every day now. And there's this researcher in London, her name is Priscilla Alderson, and she has this quote that I think is fantastic. She says, "We tend to think of children as human becomings rather than human beings." And to me, that's such a wonderful image for how we normally relate to children.
Mm-hmm. That is a great reminder. So when we're talking about having these different perspectives and recognizing that children have a different perspective, that they experience the world in a different way, and that we kind of need to enter that culture. You have a section in your introduction that the heading, I don't know that it cannot catch someone's eye. So the title of that section is "The Day My 3-Year-Old Brought Home a Condom," which I think anybody flipping through the book is going to suddenly stop there. Like, what's happening? So explain that story.
Every time I have been with somebody who's picking up the book for the first time, they flip through it and they stop on that page. So yes. So this was a couple years ago after we arrived in Switzerland. Our family was out on a Sunday, and we were coming home on the train, and my son picks up everything. I mean, he did when he was 3. He still does now that he's 5. He just likes to pick things up off the ground. And he had found a ton of stuff while he was out that day. Rocks, sticks, plastic tags, you name it. And he also happened to find a little box. So he had a box and all this stuff in it. And we got home and we're riding home on the train, and the train was packed. I mean, Sunday afternoons, lots of people go out for hikes in the mountains or to go skiing, or they're out with their families. And so the afternoon trains on Sundays are really full. So our family is packed into this little compartment, and the whole train is just, it's almost standing room only. And my son is just flipping through all of his treasures that he's found. And he's holding up, the tags and the sticks and the branches and the leaves. And he says, and I found this, he's talking to his sisters, I found this really cool shiny jam packet. And in my mind, this kind of in one ear, out the other, I was kind of halfway paying attention, halfway dozing in and out because the train was warm and I was feeling lulled to sleep. And I was thinking, jam packet, that sounds odd. And he's holding it up high, and people in the train are starting to look. And I turn around and look, and I realize it is an unopened, I will be clear about that. Right. It is an unopened condom. And my husband and I exchanged this look, and we think, oh my goodness, what are we supposed to do? And I said, Desmond, why don't you just go ahead and stick that back into your box, and we'll keep it safe till we get home. And for me, that is the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about, because to him, that object holds no meaning outside of the shiny foil and the cool plastic circle, and it was a bright blue color. It holds no value outside of the actual, the shapes and the colors that are catching to him. For the culture of adulthood, that holds incredible meaning. We know exactly what a condom is, and it's used for one thing. And so for us, in the midst of that context, if I would have reacted to him out of my own cultural background, I would have laughed, I would have, pulled it out of his hand, I would have been embarrassed and put it away because everyone on the train was looking at us. I would have reacted in a whole bunch of different ways, but because I was able to be mindful of the fact that this was not his experience with this object, I could say, how about you tuck that away so that, it still preserves my cultural need to not make a big scene on the train about him having a condom in his hands, and at the same time honor the fact that this is something cool that he found on the floor, and it was not unsafe, and he could enjoy it for what he knew it to be.
And the way that you see that from his perspective changes completely the way that you respond to it. And I love that.
Absolutely.
In and of itself, the heading alone kind of encapsulates the difference of those two perspectives, those cultural perspectives based on the experience. Because for us as adults, we read "The Day My 3-Year-Old Brought Home a Condom," and we're suddenly zeroed in for attention.
Yes.
But from your child's perspective, it'd be "The Day I Brought Home a Shiny Blue Square with some
Absolutely
in it." And you read that heading, and there's no huge meaning or a big reaction that we have, and it's just a complete difference of perspective based on experience. And the way we interact.
And I think it's similar when you look at some of the onesies that we put babies in that say things like "little flirt" or I'm here for the boobs, or there's these messages that are it's exporting the culture of adulthood onto the culture of childhood. And this would get into a different topic, but in ways that I think are perhaps inappropriate. That's not a place for us to get a laugh out of at the expense of children. Again, that's a tangent not to go down right now, but again, we take these things from adulthood and we import them into the culture of childhood in ways that children don't pick up or understand.
Right, and I would say with the onesies that you mentioned, even whether or not you argue whether it's appropriate or not, the fact that it is funny to us is because we recognize that there's this incongruity between their experience and the reality, and yet it's funny when we put it there. But if that's the reality that we're living in, I don't know if I'm articulating them very well, but it's funny because there's an incongruence, and yet we don't realize that maybe throughout the day, throughout our lives, we are creating that same incongruence without even registering it.
I think that's a powerful way to think about it. And if we consider that incongruence, our social understanding of that incongruence is that children just haven't caught up to us yet. You know, once they get to be teenagers, once they get to be adults, they're going to look at this and think that's funny. Again, not that any parents are thinking that when they put their kids in the onesies, but you know, that our sense of humor is somehow sophisticated. Like, we've arrived. We have a sense of humor. Children don't have a sense of humor because to them that's not funny. You know, so that incongruity, you know, maybe this is stretching the onesie example too far, but in every aspect, when we have incongruity between the culture of childhood and the culture of adulthood, I think there's a place for us on a continuum model where we recognize that society is continuing to measure children by the yardstick of adulthood, rather than in a different model where we see that children have competency and have wholeness and are complete in and of themselves. So instead of saying, to use this onesie example a little bit more, instead of saying children don't have a sense of humor because their sense of humor doesn't match my own, to be able to say, I wonder if children have a sense of humor, what that sense of humor looks like. And for those of us who have spent any time around children, we know that they have a sense of humor.
Absolutely.
It may be a sense of humor that gets irritating to us because it's repetitive, or that gets, you know, we may react to their sense of humor because our culture is coming up into contact with their culture in a way that doesn't, you know, again, it's a sense of incongruity, the sense of disequilibrium. But instead of just writing off that sense of humor as it's unsophisticated, it's uncivilized, it's undeveloped, it's not valuable, to be able to say, this is representative of their culture, and what does it mean to let the two cultures exist side by side without everyone wanting to pull their hair out?
Well, I could talk about this all day, and luckily this isn't our only edition. We're going to have several of these episodes talking about different sections of the book, so we can take it as our read-along book and go through as readers of Not Just Cute or followers of this podcast are reading the book. They can pop in and hear your take, some of the background information on some of these sections, and also chime in on some of the discussion as these are added together, and we have a question and answer at the end. So Emily Plank, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to jump into this.
Thank you, Amanda.
We're going to jump into this next section soon and talk more about these perspectives and how they shape our interaction with children and help us to better relate with them, better serve them, and better work together. So thank you for joining me, and we'll catch up on those next sections.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We'll talk to each other soon.
All right, thanks. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 3. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com, and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.